Hi, everyone. This is Ian from Unincorporated, and I want to welcome you to a special episode of the Higher Ed Happy Hour. We're dedicating this episode to active learning and what you should think about when approaching learning design for higher education. I'm here with an expert on this topic, Richard Holeton. Richard is a writer, an education consultant, an Assistant Vice Provost for Learning Environments Emeritus at Stanford University, following a 30-year career as an educator and academic technology leader. So delighted to have you on the show today, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ian.
So we're going to get right to it. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you went from writing a critically recognized hypertext, this is a novel 20 years ago, and to now where you find yourself engaged in planning and designing learning spaces. That's quite a trajectory. Tell us about that.
Well, I feel I've been really lucky insofar as those two trajectories that you described have kind of co-developed for me. My writing career, especially writing with new media, and my career in academia have been fortunately mutually reinforcing. So as a fiction writer, I was an early adopter of new technologies. I mean, I go back to the first Macs and in the 80s, and including the early web and so on. And likewise, I was teaching writing, and as a writing teacher, I was teaching in and managing early computer classrooms, what we called them then, at Stanford, beginning in the late 1980s. So at the same time that I was exploring hypertext as a mode for writing fiction, which led to my novel, then my novel, by the way, became obsolete, but has been resuscitated and is now available on the web in modern web software. So I was then introducing students to networked interaction, synchronous and asynchronous electronic discussion, the emerging internet, and the web. So in the 1990s, we kind of had the early days of what's become known as blended learning or hybrid learning, where some activities are still taking place in person, face-to-face, co-located, and some activities are starting to happen online outside the physical classroom. So the implications of all this for the design of physical learning spaces became apparent, I guess, quickly. And the first computer classrooms, which some people will remember, were basically designed by technologists. They wanted to put the computers in rows because the other classrooms were in rows, or that was the easiest way to connect to power and internet and so on. So they just copied that.
Right.
The technology enhanced classroom that we were lucky enough to design at Stanford with a grant from Apple was one of the first that was designed by teachers instead of by technologists. So we put the computers around the perimeter of the room so they weren't in between students. And in the middle, we put movable chairs and tables arranged in a seminar style seating, but tables could be moved around, rearranged for small group work. And the chairs had casters so you could wheel around and go to the computers when you wanted to use those. And everything was connected, and there was a big, display screen and so on. So anyway, that was the beginning for me of thinking about designing or redesigning college classrooms for teaching and learning at the same time that I was writing a hypertext novel. Now, I can add that the seed for all this about learning spaces was actually planted for me years before that, when and kind of laid dormant, I guess, because I had taught preschool for a couple years. that's 3 to 5 year olds. And that was much earlier in my career. And I had a mentor at the preschool where I mainly taught, who was all about learning spaces. And she taught us, other teachers, to constantly redesign the room, divided into discrete spaces. Each space had to be defined. And in those days, we wrote it on an index card for each space, defining how many people were supposed to be there and what the learning activity was. Was it dramatic play or small motor skills, et cetera? And we divided the spaces with partitions hung from the ceiling. I guess the fire department would not like that nowadays. But the excitement of the kids when they came in each morning to a different classroom was incredible. So that was my first introduction to learning spaces, which kind of got buried until I ended up teaching college later.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure this question is going to pop up for those listening, but give us the name of the novel. You said it's been resurrected. So if anyone looking for that, what's the name that they should search for there?
You bet. It's called Figursky at Findhorn on Acid.
Okay.
And if you,
pretty
you
specific title there.
Figursky at Findhornonacid.com is where it's located. It's got every combination of 3 characters, 3 places, and 3 artifacts is kind of the basic structure of the novel.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Thanks for sharing the name there. So I'm really fascinated by this idea that learning space in the physical environment took a while to be considered, right? You mentioned that initially learning spaces were designed by technologists, and only up until a certain point were the educators involved. I'm also fascinated by this idea that one's career, whether it's writing or teaching, educating, that those can be mutually enforcing, right? So you have these learning spaces that actually can contribute to kind of mutually enforce the ability of a teacher to, transmit knowledge or, encourage learning. But now we're kind of moving into learning space within a digital environment. And I feel like there are still those early adopters, or there's still a lot of people, grappling with this idea of how do we make the digital learning space conducive to learning? How do we make it mutually enforcing, to use your phrase there? And you give us some guidance on this. You've developed this learning space rating system, or the LSRS. And this, I guess, is to assess the potential. I'm going to quote you here. It, quote, assesses the potential of physical environments to enable teaching and learning engagement. Is that correct? And what can you expand upon with regards to the LSRS and how it's helpful with this initiative of designing good learning spaces?
Yeah, and you're right. The LSRS is about physical learning spaces. And so far, that means mostly formal learning spaces. So that is classrooms. And yeah, it's a tool for measuring the design of these classrooms and the degree to which they can facilitate multiple modalities of learning and teaching. We're on version 3 now, and due credit to my colleagues, 3 different groups of colleagues. I've been with it for 3 versions now. We released version 3 last year after a lot of testing and feedback from the higher ed community, mainly on the earlier version. So it's a rating system, which means it has a series of credits, like the LEED system that is commonly used in the U.S. for rating green building standards that many people are familiar with, or the WELL building standards, which is more used in the UK, I think, but somewhat used in the US. These systems apply metrics to aspects of the built environment. So LEED, as many people know, measures sustainability features, and the WELL system measures things that impact from the environment, impact health and well-being. The LSRS is intended to measure aspects of the built environment that impact learning. There's plenty of overlap between learning and health and well-being. So the WELL system is definitely complementary to the LSRS, and I recommend people look at that also. So the LSRS has 7 sections in 2 basic parts, 2 main parts. Now, part A is focused on the global or macro level, the campus context, and its sections are integration with campus context, planning and design process, and support and operations. Quick examples of credits within, say, support and operations are called training of the support team, faculty instructor development, where you get points for training faculty to take advantage of the capabilities of learning space. Then part B has 4 sections, and it's kind of about the stuff that goes into the spaces, the design and affordances, the actual things. So its sections are environmental quality, layout and furnishings, technology and tools, and inclusion. So you get credits, or you don't get credits for things like seating density, how many square feet per student, having lots of visual displays and writable surfaces. I often joke that we call them writable surfaces, but really all surfaces are writable, but not all surfaces are erasable. So we should call them erasable surfaces.
That's funny. So the LSRS feels like it could be applied not just to a classroom or campus environment, but it could be applied to co-working spaces, office spaces, creative studios. Would you agree with that?
To some extent. It's pretty specific to classrooms, but many of the principles, I agree, can be generalized to those kinds of environments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how does this evolve? Is it part of the plan for this to evolve into considerations for the digital spaces that we're now learning through and partaking in as learners and educators?
No, because I would say that the flow has been rather the other way around. That is, there's research about, well, there's also research that our stuff is based on, but there's research about designing online interactions and online spaces that in some cases we've been inspired by or tried to say, how does this apply to physical space? But that's not what we claim to have expertise on. And that's a whole other thing, interaction design and so on. It's a whole, a whole field with its own set of research and expertise. But we intersect with that, and importantly, because all experiences are hybrid or blended. So you always have one foot in physical, almost always one foot in a physical space, physical learning space, even if it's your bedroom or a coffee shop, and one foot in online spaces. And so thinking about how they work together is important.
Right. But you're suggesting that the framework that you've developed here actually intersects with other frameworks. It's not intended to be an all-inclusive framework applied to both hybrid, online, and physical. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Great. And let's say I'm, senior administrator, vice provost, maybe even president of a university, and I want to go through this exercise of taking the assessment, if that's what it is, but basically applying the LSRS to my campus and to my classrooms. How would one go about that?
Well, you download the tool from EDUCAUSE, with whom we've partnered recently, and there's you can Google Learning Space Rating System, or there's a vanity URL, learningspaceratingsystem.org, that'll take you to the EDUCAUSE site, and then you download right now it's a PDF, and then there's a score sheet that you can download also. The one little hoop you have to jump through is you need to have a profile on the EDUCAUSE site, which if you're one of those people you just described, it's very likely you already have a profile on EDUCAUSE. But if anyone doesn't, you don't have to be in higher ed, or you don't have to be anything. Anyone can quickly establish a profile and a login. Then once you do that, you're good to go. The reason we do that is so we can gather some data about who's using the tool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when you have it, then you would work with it's nice to get a cross disciplinary group to do this kind of rating. That is, we recommend having someone from teaching and learning, someone from IT area or AV area, classroom support, the classroom people, obviously, if that's depending how your place is organized. If you're renovating spaces or building new spaces, then bring in the architects. I mean, and get students to participate. And then it's a self-rating system so far. So there isn't we don't have a set of trained, raters who can go around and certify your results. So it's really for your own information for the most part. And it's very useful in comparing your spaces, your worst spaces with your better spaces. Look at the scores, look at the different dimensions in which they differ, identify weak spots, and you get a really good evaluation of your classroom stock or individual classrooms.
And you mentioned this can be applied to the campus environment as well. So it's a macro assessment as well as a micro assessment, or is it geared more toward the classrooms?
Well, the macro part is going to be, the ratings for that section are going to be mostly the same for every classroom, because it asks questions like about your support and operations, how you train people, what the support is, what the planning and design process is like. So does it do some of those things I just mentioned? Does it include, students in your diverse set of students in your planning process? Are you syncing up with your other campus strategic plans? Is there a master plan for learning spaces on your campus? So it's all those kind of global questions. Are you preparing faculty to teach in your spaces? What's the training like? Do you have an online module? Do you have people that go and hold their hands? And so those are all global campus level and sometimes political questions in that part.
Yeah. So you do the assessment. There is some reflection, some self-reflection. Basically, you have to answer honestly. Do you then get kind of a report on the areas you should fix, or is it sort of intuitive based on how you answer those questions of what remedies or fixes or changes are needed?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a self-analysis basically, and it's apparent what the range might be and what the areas of weakness might be.
Right.
We've said, we think, and one of the drivers for creating this was for those of us working on campuses, is to simply call attention to the state of the learning spaces, because almost every campus has all these legacy spaces that are, sometimes pretty crappy. And so a classic strategy for those of us advocating for resources to change that has been to take those senior administrators and have a meeting with them, but meet in the worst classrooms that you can find, that you have. And and because they may not have ever been there. And so you sit down there and you might say, well, this scored, 21 or something out of 87 or whatever it might be. And here's why. And they're like, we didn't know we had classrooms like this. And we're like, yeah. So, you want students to learn in here and have an equitable experience and so on. So, but yeah, it's self-analysis. You can compare, you can do the, play the, at Stanford, you to get things done at Stanford, you usually have to usually want to compare to the peer institutions. So everybody compares to their peer institutions. So sure. We play that, well, at Harvard they're doing this, and so and that's whatever the comparable thing is at State University, at community college, at wherever, you can compare. We caution that LSRS scores are not really comparable, right? Because everyone's measuring their own spaces. And so it's kind of subjective to your campus. So although maybe on gross scores, you could say, well, they rated all their classrooms X and ours average Y.
Yeah. Well, I like this. I appreciate this ability to benchmark against peer institutions, or if you are a community college, give yourself an honest assessment and then see maybe how you stack up against the Ivy League score. So thanks for taking some time to walk us through the mechanics. I know we got pretty tactical in terms of how this works. Maybe we can take a bigger or broader view now and just walk us through the rubric. It's really fascinating that you've developed such an intelligent rubric and identified, those aspects, those criteria, if you will, on, what makes or what enhances the learning experience. So how did you come up with this rubric, and how did you identify those ideal aspects of learning spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've strived, or maybe we've striven. I was an English teacher, right? So I guess I should know, to base all of our asserted best practices on educational research. And we provide a list of references and resources there on the LSRS site. And those are what we, base our claims on. In this question of how can the space influence the learning that takes place there, it's a crucial one. I think above all, we should remember that the quality of any learning experience is mostly determined by the students and the instructors, more so than by the physical environment. Are the students motivated to learn? How effective are the instructors' teaching practices, the design of the curriculum, and so on? But research does show that aspects of the built environment can impact learning. And so for starters, I think it's helpful to think about Maslow's famous old pyramid or hierarchy of needs. If you apply that to learning, you can, see that, at the bottom level, if your basic safety and physiological needs aren't being met, you're not going to be in a position to be learning. You can't learn very well if you're hungry, thirsty, too hot, too cold, and so on. So the physical environment has to address those needs. And we see that like in developing countries and so on, like that doesn't happen sometimes. But we're also getting on a higher level, we're getting constantly messages from the environment that impact our cognition. And some would say in the theory of embodied cognition suggests that we only experience things in the context of a physical space and in interaction with that space. So, and a lot of these messages are non-conscious, the air pressure, the temperature, and so on, but they affect our behavior and they affect our cognition. We're affected by the materials that are used in spaces, the shape and size and colors of rooms, how high the ceiling is, changes people's behavior, whether they're sharp edges or round, smooth, round curves. And humans respond usually non-consciously to a lot of those elements of the environment. And on another level, we get social and cultural messages from the environment. And so a room filled with rows of fixed seats facing a stage and a lectern gives the message implicit in the so-called designed pedagogy or architecture that gives the message that learning in that space is going to be about somebody delivering knowledge to rows of mostly passive listeners. And if you walk into a room that's decentered, it has no stage, and it has clusters of small mobile tables, says that the activities that are going to take place there are going to involve interaction with other humans. So this all extends to the affordances of the technologies that are provided in spaces. So if you want to enable certain activities, and LSRS is all about what activities are enabled, right? Because we can't control what happens in the space. That's controlled by the teaching. But we can enable things to happen by the design of the room. So we want to enable activities that research has shown are effective for learning, and so provide tools for those.
That's a great gift that you are providing to those who want to enable learning and improve these spaces or design these ideal spaces from scratch. I think it's also commendable that you've stayed true to your course, stayed true to your vision that this is about the physical environment. And what I heard you just share now too is that you can't control the educator or the teaching or the activities, right? You could be in a hot room with sharp edges, very small, and have maybe some of the best activities and the best educator in that room. It's going to change the whole experience. So I appreciate the boundaries or the parameters that you've kind of put outside of this framework. But I think the framework itself is a gift. So what compelled you to create this gift? What compelled you? What was the vision or the impetus, the genesis of feeling compelled to create the LSRS?
Yeah, well, when we started in the early 2010s, I think the first beta version we released in 2014, we could see that a substantial community had evolved already around learning space design in higher ed, and spurred by early work. There was a book by Diana Oblinger called Learning Spaces that we were having conferences and workshops. There's a discussion group in EDUCAUSE called the Learning Space Design Community Group with hundreds of members. So there are all these discussions happening and people sharing their experiences. And I think we felt that for that community to evolve, that there was a bit of a vacuum in terms of best practices or common practices and a shared taxonomy, shared language, and not only to encourage more research in the field, which was lacking early on, but yeah, to begin to create a shared language that we could use not only within our institutions but across institutions and with those outside, like architects and designers and AV integrators and other groups that we work with on campus to build new spaces and renovate old spaces. And I think we tried to reflect the language and taxonomies that we were hearing, from our colleagues in all those areas. And then I guess at the same time, kind of putting a stake in the ground and saying, here's a way to try to measure things. And I think the other thing I mentioned previously is that we, for very practical and political purposes, those of us working on campuses, we wanted a tool that we could use to call attention to spaces that needed attention, to try to get resources. That's everybody's always, working and competing to get those resources to address those needs. And that's when we would bring people into the, into the crappy classrooms. But I think those were a lot of the motivations.
So there was a need for a shared language and a shared taxonomy, and there was a need for educators and administrators to substantiate the needs that they could recognize intuitively or otherwise, and make a case for why money or a line item in a budget should be applied to a learning space. Yeah,
you said it.
So will this one day then be the standard? Is it the standard now? Like, is it to learning space? Is LSRS to learning spaces what LEED is to architecture?
That's our aspiration, but I'd say we're a ways from that. And for some people, it's working like that. We don't have a LEED. It has is a very well established system. It is similar to analogous because in LEED you can get a gold star or platinum star, whatever you get from LEED for the design of your building, right? And then people, when they actually use it, they leave the doors open and the air conditioner's running, right? So it's like how it's actually used is a separate situation from how it was designed to be used. But anyway, we would like to get there, but we're not there.
Who's competing with you?
Well, I don't know that there's any direct competition for, I'd say there are complementary efforts, like the well building standards are very well developed. They're really have a great website, and you can drill down on all their criteria, and they're well researched, and they have their standards, I think, that are more objective, and so that's a complementary effort, I think. And then I should mention FlexSpace, FlexSpace, FLEX space.org, another complementary effort. And we work closely with FlexSpace as another partner to LSRS. And they are a repository searchable database of learning spaces. where members of the community can upload photos and information about their spaces to share with everybody, so people can go and search for, we're going to renovate our lecture hall, so let me see good examples of ones and descriptions of ones that have been done elsewhere. And in FlexSpace, you can upload spaces and your LSRS scores. So there's a little tool for putting in your LSRS scores.
Nice. What makes for a good score? What's the average?
I can't answer that. I have to look at the instrument and go back and add up the totals, or look at the score sheet. And some of the elements, some of the credits have multiple. You get 1 point for doing this, 2 points for doing this, and 3 points if you do. So some of them have multiple levels of point you can earn.
Okay, fair enough. So the vision statement, if you will, we covered that. We covered the how-to and the mechanics, the what's included and how you might implement this. Talked a little bit about the need, why this was created in the first place. Have you seen results? Has it made an impact? What changes, or where have you seen, I guess, the evolution or the changes in learning environments over the last couple decades, or over this work that you've been engaged in?
Well, I think it would be difficult to claim too much about LSRS causing, improvements in learning spaces. I think it's more that it's been helpful to people in assessing their spaces and moving forward, and it's starting to show up in research papers. So, for example, we're starting to see published research that has used LSRS. There's one about comparing LSRS scores before and after the pandemic, for example. And I think adoption has increased, and now we're getting data about its usage. There's thousands of downloads, and we know who's using it. And so there's lots of interest at conferences and in online discussion. So, I mean, those are the only real measures we have. We have lots of anecdotal accounts of people using the tools at their institutions and that having helped them.
Yeah. Would you agree that learning spaces in general have improved over the last decade or two?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All because of the LSRS.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly. But sure, absolutely, because there's just a lot more awareness about, also because teaching is changing. And as faculty are using, and that's been a real change, that faculty are using more active learning pedagogies and have been persuaded that active learning, from their own research showing that active learning pedagogies are more effective for teaching this discipline or that discipline, then they're demanding spaces that help them do that. So, I mean, it's an ongoing project to convert a vast legacy built environment of classrooms that were built to support the pedagogy of 100 years ago and adapt it to these other modalities. But that is happening everywhere. And if money were no object, everyone would rebuild and retool all their classrooms.
Right. Every space would have erasable surfaces and props and Post-it notes and anything that you might need for the active learning. It reminds me of, and it's reminiscent of, the Montessori school philosophy and having like workstations, right, that the student goes to throughout the course of a day. But yeah, I agree that I too have seen an evolution in learning spaces, as well as just within our industry of design in general. There's been more interest in understanding of how design can help organizations continue to grow and help business move forward, right? So I think there's just a general kind of cultural or societal shift in understanding that design, whether it's physical or otherwise, is meaningful to the value of, you know, that artifact that you're creating.
I agree.
So
and it's interesting that you
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it's interesting you mentioned Montessori, because the mentor teacher that I learned from early about learning spaces was Montessori trained along with other pedagogies. She had mashed up Montessori with other things, but Montessori is very much about, and I taught in a Montessori school briefly too, is very much about those spaces and space and the whole language of space. And that learning is going to take place in the context of a space that has some design, as you're saying, some design to it.
Yeah. Yeah, the design thinking applied to a space in order to enhance the activity, in this case, the activity being teaching and learning, or the transfer of knowledge. And it's powerful. It's really powerful. So there's another emphasis right now with the DEI, or I think in higher education circles, it's EDI, but equity, diversity, and inclusion. So how can this system, or in what ways, I should ask, how can this system help promote some of the equity, diversity, and inclusion standards or considerations that we're trying to uphold now in our institutions?
Yeah, indeed, we are, and in fact, much of the impetus for our version 3 was exactly to promote inclusion, apply it to the design of learning spaces. So I mentioned in reeling off the sections, we have a dedicated section now. We had smatterings of trying to talk about inclusive learning spaces in version 2, but for version 3, we created a dedicated section called inclusion. I think you had a recent podcast with about DEI with Tricia Dow, so I know you're looking into this, so we have this dedicated section in the LSRS. We do feel that these notions permeate, though, throughout it. We have a lot of related credits and so on. So an example would be in section 2, which is about the planning and design process. I mentioned we give points for creating diverse, inclusive design teams. And that's where it starts. Who's doing the designing? Who are you including?
Smart.
That are representative of the learning community. So inclusion begins, well before you're designing the actual space. But this question is, first of all, I guess we have to go back to that the main way that you create an inclusive learning environment is through teaching practice, through pedagogy. So teachers who are trained in inclusive teaching practices, which we're not addressing in the LSRS, although it's informed by those practices. Those teachers can implement inclusive practices in virtually any space. What we were talking about before is kind of good teaching trumps bad spaces, and bad teaching trumps good spaces. You can have a room that scores 1,000% on the LSRS, and there's no guarantee that inclusive teaching is going to take place there. However, our goal is to articulate some things in the built environment that can, first of all, do no harm to inclusion efforts. And maybe I'll give an example of how harm has definitely been done in the past. Second, to facilitate, enhance those inclusive teaching practices. Now, we're treading a little bit of new ground insofar as there's little direct research on the relationship between space design and inclusion. So we've used design. We use other concepts that are established by research, including from social psychology and so on. So let me kind of go through that, because this is a part that I was heavily involved in version 3 myself, and there's an article about this I wrote for EDUCAUSE Review too.
Okay.
So our approach is to take 3 aspects of inclusion, which we think are not mutually exclusive, but are really overlapping and kind of like 3 perspectives or lenses. And those are physical inclusion, cognitive inclusion, and cultural inclusion. So first, physical inclusion credit is designed to welcome learners with different physical abilities, not only by providing access, but also the opportunity to participate fully in the learning experience. So in other words, we emphasize people participating fully or equitably, going beyond the ADA requirements to just have wheelchairs be able to get into the space and line up against the back. That's not equitable participation. Only be allowed to sit in the back or on the margins of a space, right? So Everything about physical inclusion is about making sure everyone can have the same chance to have the same experience in the space, including access to all the affordances of the room. Secondly, what we've called cognitive inclusion is really about applying UDL, which is Universal Design for Learning, which is a pedagogy, set of teaching practices, and applying that to what does that mean in terms of physical design of the space. So with UDL, you want to offer students multiple ways to receive and engage with and express information. And that's because students, not only on the autism spectrum, but all students, people in general, have a wide range of cognitive strategies of how they best receive information, engage with environments, express knowledge, and so on.
Right.
So in UDL, teachers present content in verbal, visual, experiential ways. And likewise, students should be able to process information, respond, and express themselves in all those ways. So this really comes down to facilitating multiple modalities for learning and teaching, providing space to move around, writing surfaces, multiple displays, and other technologies. And that's as we've talked about, that's the main thrust of the LSRS itself. So in that way, also inclusion is at the heart of the LSRS, I think. Now, the third area is the diciest, or the most complex or difficult, we've called cultural inclusion. And the LSRS team has wrestled with this for years, actually. How do you quantify cultural inclusion? How can the physical environment help create a sense of belonging and make spaces welcoming and inviting to different people? And the way that we have thought about it is in the sense of social identities, because there is a strong research base in social psychology about social identities and identity threat, as it's called. And it suggests that markers of social identity, and social identity are things like, groups that we identify with, like based on gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, and so on. And markers of identity in spaces do impact, and there's research for this, student performance and student learning, and certainly their sense of belonging. Everyone has a need for a sense of belonging. And so, and these identities, of course, are complex, as we know. It's called intersectionality. That is, most of us identify with more than one of these groups, right? So threats to identity, one of them is called stereotype threat, which is the perception of negative stereotypes about a group that you might belong to. Those have been shown to impair learning and student success. So obviously the presence of those is not a welcome or inclusive factor, right? So this fundamental dilemma is, what are the trade-offs between removing those bad or, non-inclusive, non-welcoming markers of social identity that might make people uncomfortable, and adding markers of social identity that might make people feel welcome? So that's kind of how we framed it. And speaking of doing no harm, removing markers, unwelcome markers, we should note that many of our campus spaces were designed historically in a context of exclusion, of excluding certain groups. For example, large groups like women, or ethnic minorities. And for years, nobody even thought about, naming a building or naming a residence hall to honor someone who had enslaved some of the people living there's recent ancestors, or examples abound, welcoming a new female ethnic minority faculty member in a reception room and the room is lined with pictures of white men all around. Right. And, so, the obvious question is, do I belong here? And just a couple more things, because this cultural inclusion is a really interesting area, and we really want to hear from people about their successes and failures with designing spaces for this. A trend in modernist architecture has been to remove cultural markers and make spaces kind of neutral or culture free. Yeah. And you and I might say that's not really possible to make a space neutral. But you asked about online research, research about online learning environments, and there is some research that we've taken and been inspired by there, that adding visual, verbal, and symbolic elements can have an effect. So changing the language in the description of a STEM course to make it more gender neutral, or making it more of visual representations of women in promoting those courses. Those studies about that showing that actually increases enrollment of women by making them feel more welcome. So the same thing we suggest will apply to physical spaces.
Yeah.
Can apply.
Well, I think that's a great framework. And to remind everyone listening, this framework of, promoting inclusivity through physical, cognitive, and cultural markers, this has been applied to version 3 and is available for download if you go to the learningspacerating.org, you can actually find that information readily available. We've covered a lot. I've really appreciated learning directly from you in this space, in this environment that we've created together today. Are there any other thoughts or, I don't know, final recommendations or considerations that you want to leave with the audience?
Well, maybe one that you alluded to earlier, which is that we hope that the LSRS principles of the LSRS apply not just to classrooms but beyond. And a future thing we might do is take on informal spaces, so-called informal learning spaces, which is basically everywhere else, right? But libraries, residence halls, student unions. We know that most learning takes place outside the classroom, not inside the classroom. So in that sense, the general campus environment is even more important. And so I guess I would just encourage people to think about the whole campus, including the online environment, because everything is hybrid or blended, as one big learning space or learning environment. And as you've also suggested, think about that from a design perspective. How do people move through those spaces? How do they talk to each other? The spaces talk to each other. The technologies talk to each other. And how do students interact with faculty outside the classroom? Because that's also important to student success. And so the design of the built environment and outdoor spaces as well have an influence on all that.
Yeah, that's great. So you're alluding to an LSRS for informal spaces, which are basically all of those other spaces that we learn in. One of those spaces that I can attest to where I'm constantly learning is in my car, right? So maybe we could apply some of this framework to an in-transit university or in-transit learning space, which are our cars or our subway systems, our public transportation. But this is absolutely a delight. Richard, thanks for spending time with me today. I know you've brought a lot of value to not only your field and your work, but those listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ian. My pleasure.